Chapter 6, New Zealand's Constitution. 6.1, what is a constitution? A constitution is a set of rules that control how a group or an organization is run. For example, a local soccer club might have a constitution. It might have rules about how people can get into power and run the soccer club, and what rules they'll have to follow once they're in power. On a bigger scale than a soccer club, countries also have constitutions. A country's constitution is a set of rules that say what the government can and can't do. For example, a constitution would likely control how governments can be elected, who can vote, and what kind of power the government has once they're elected. 6.2, does New Zealand have a constitution? New Zealand is interesting because it's one of the only countries in the world that has a constitution that doesn't exist in one single written document. The only other two countries that don't have this are England and Israel. This means that New Zealand has what is called an unwritten constitution. So if you want to find New Zealand's constitution, you can't Google it and get one big written document. Instead, you have to look in a whole bunch of different places to find the rules that control New Zealand's government. So yes, New Zealand does have a constitution. However, it's not written in one big single document. This makes it what's called an unwritten constitution. 6.3, where can you find New Zealand's constitution? I'll now explain 5 places where you can find New Zealand's constitution. The first is legislation. New Zealand's constitution can be found in both old and new statutes. Old statutes, like the Magna Carta, usually play more of a symbolic role in our constitution. However, newer legislation made by Parliament form an important part of the Constitution. For example, the Electoral Act 1993 is part of the Constitution. This statute controls things like when elections happen, who can vote, who can't vote, etc. Some other statutes that are part of New Zealand's Constitution include the Parliamentary Privilege Act 2014, the Senior Courts Act 2016, the Human Rights Act 1993, and the Bill of Rights Act 1990, which we'll look at in more depth in the next chapter. 2. Cases. Cases that make laws or interpret laws about how New Zealand's government can and can't act form part of the Constitution. 3. Prerogative powers. The King, who exercises his power in New Zealand through the Governor-General, has some powers in New Zealand to control the government. These powers cannot be found in any statutes or cases. They're historical powers that just exist. Some of these powers are part of the Constitution. 4. Treaties. Some treaties have particular importance to the Constitution. For example, the Treaty of Waitangi is very constitutionally important, and we'll look at that later on in the course. 5. Constitutional conventions. Constitutional conventions aren't laws that are written down anywhere. Instead, they're just things that happen because they've always happened that way. For example, the Governor-General needs to sign off on every law made by Parliament before it can become a law. This is called the Governor-General giving her royal assent to a law. Technically, the Governor-General doesn't have to sign off on a law if she chooses not to. However, this has never happened. This convention that the Governor-General agrees to every law Parliament makes is part of New Zealand's Constitution. Those are 5 of the main places where you can find rules that make up New Zealand's Constitution. 6.4, criticisms of New Zealand's Constitution. New Zealand's Constitution has been criticised for being both confusing and hard to find. A constitution is a very important part of a country, and in New Zealand, it's been said that even a smart person wouldn't easily be able to find what the country's constitution is. 2 prominent academics, one who was formerly the Prime Minister of New Zealand, wrote an interesting book arguing that New Zealand should create a written constitution. The book even contains an example constitution, which they wrote. I think this is an interesting idea. However, the public doesn't seem particularly interested in changing the constitution right now. So I think it's an idea that's not really going to go anywhere for a while.